The agrarian protest was just one of many indications of national political crisis that was emerging in the 1890s. There was a severe depression beginning in 1893. There was also widespread labor unrest, culminating in very violent strikes of 1894. You recall the Pullman strike was also in 1894. There was the continuing failure of either party to address these issues. And there was the rigid fiscal conservatism of Grover Cleveland, who took office for the second time just as the economy collapsed. All of this culminated in the dramatic campaign of 1896, an election on which many Americans felt the future of the nation hung. The Panic of 1893 resulted in the worst depression the nation had ever seen. It began in March 1893 when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, unable to make payments on loans to British banks, declared bankruptcy. 2 months later, the National Cordage Company, this is another major corporation, also failed. Both failures together triggered a stock market collapse. This image on the right is the logo of the National Cordage Company. It's the largest maker of ropes and cables in America. It's a huge company. It would be like Microsoft failing today. Since many New York banks were heavy investors in the stock market, which today banks can't invest in stocks, bank failures soon began. This began a massive contraction of credit, which caused the failure of many fairly new and otherwise healthy businesses because they were unable to borrow. Credit is the lifeblood of an economy. There were other longer-range causes of this financial collapse. There were depressed agricultural prices. Since 1887 had weakened farmers, still the largest group of the population. The depression had begun a little bit earlier in Europe, resulting in a loss of European markets and investment to the U.S. The Europeans were financially strapped, so they couldn't buy American goods, nor could they continue to lend money to the U.S. Railroads and other industries had expanded too rapidly, creating more capacity than the market really could soak up. The Depression showed how interconnected the parts of the U.S. had become and how dependent the economy was on the health of the railroads, still the largest and most powerful corporate and financial institutions in America. Once the panic began, it spread with shocking speed. Within 6 months, more than 8,000 businesses had failed, including 156 railroads and 400 banks. Agricultural prices, which were already low, tumbled. Up to 1 million workers, about 20% of the workforce, lost their jobs. This was the highest level of unemployment in American history to that point. The Great Depression would be comparable. The Depression was not only severe but long. Although things improved slightly beginning in 1895, it was not until 1901 when there was a full return to prosperity. Naturally, the suffering caused great social unrest. You have a large number of unemployed, you're going to have some social unrest. In 1894, a guy named Jacob Coxey, C-O-X-E-Y, and he was an Ohio businessman and populist. He began calling for a massive public works campaign to provide jobs and also for an inflation of the currency. When Congress made no progress on this request, Coxey said he would send a petition to Washington with its boots on, meaning an army. It was called Coxey's Army. It only numbered about 500 people after reaching Washington. They marched from Ohio, and armed police barred them from the Capitol and arrested Coxey, who was later convicted of walking on the grass. There continued to be considerable labor unrest during this period, and the middle class continued to see that as a sign of dangerous instability, which heightened the general sense of crisis. The financial panic considerably weakened the government's monetary system. President Cleveland was among those who thought monetary instability caused the Depression. It's called the money question. The passion around the monetary system is hard for present-day people to understand. During most of its existence as a nation, the U.S. had recognized two metals as a basis for currency. This is called bimetallism. In the 1870s, this had changed. The official ratio of the value of silver to the value of gold was 16-1, meaning 16 ounces of silver was worth as much as one ounce of gold. But the market, that was the official ratio, but the market ratio of silver was much higher. Silver owners could get more by selling their silver for jewelry or for other uses, because there were now new industrial uses as well. They could get more money for silver that way than by taking it to the mint. So they stopped taking it there. and the mint just sort of stopped coining silver because of market forces. In 1873, Congress therefore passed a law demonetizing silver. Few objected at the time. After all, the silver miners were getting more money for other uses. But then later in the 1870s, the market value of silver fell below the old official ratio of 16 to 1. Silver was available for coinage again. Many Americans concluded that a conspiracy of bankers had foreclosed silver as a currency option to create deflation. They referred to this demonetization of silver in 1873 as the crime of 1873. Two groups were especially focused on reversing the crime of 73: silver miners, for obvious reasons, and farmers, because farmers wanted inflation. They were hurt by deflation. At the same time, the nation's gold reserves were dropping, and the Panic of 1893 further stressed those gold reserves. Now, to pacify the inflationist, at one point Congress had passed something called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, which required the government to purchase silver but not coin it, and they paid for it in gold. So it was sort of a token move to the inflationists. It didn't really create inflation, but it did help the silver interest somewhat, but they didn't buy much. Cleveland believed that this Silver Purchase Act of 1890, which sort of semi-remonetized silver, was the chief cause of the weakening gold reserves, because, of course, they paid for the silver in gold. Early in his second administration, a special session repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, although only after a bitter battle that caused a major rift in the Democratic Party. The Southern and Western Democrats aligned against Cleveland and the Eastern Democrats. The Eastern Democrats were more focused on industrial interest, and the Southern and Western were, of course, focused on agricultural interests. One therefore wanted inflation, one wanted deflation. By now, both sides had invested the currency question with great emotional and symbolic importance. Rarely has an issue been so divisive in American history. This passion culminated in the election of 1896. Supporters of the gold standard, who were called gold bugs, they considered its survival essential to the honor and stability of the nation. Supporters of free silver considered the gold standard an instrument of tyranny. They believed that silver, the people's money, would solve all economic ills. Gold was the money of oppression.